Good morning, everybody. I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we all meet, and I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Thanks ever so much for joining us today at today's webinar covering the issues of implementing the adaptive harvest management, understanding how it works for duck hunting in Victoria. My name is Luke Holland. I'm your host and facilitator for today, and I'm joined by our two panelists, Graeme Ford, the CEO of the Game Management Authority, and Simon Toop, the Director of Strategy and Research at the Game Management Authority. If I could just start off with a few bits of housekeeping. Just to let all attendees know that the session is being recorded today, so contributions made and questions and things will be recorded and captured. All attendees, as you will have noticed, have their microphones muted and cameras switched off. We're very keen for contributions in the form of questions to be submitted. If you pop those into the Q&A function, they'll be picked up by the team and shared with us. At the end and after the presentation, Graeme and Simon will be answering as many of the questions as possible as time allows. Just to say at the start of today's webinar that the subject that we're covering, the adaptive harvest management for Victoria, if you could keep your questions in that space, that would be fantastic. Anything that time doesn't allow us to pick up, the team at the Game Management Authority will endeavour to respond to after the session has finished. Also, just to let you know that closed captioning is enabled for this event. You can turn this on if you want to, just by clicking the button with the letters CC at the bottom of your screen. And lastly, if you have any more information or questions about the webinar itself, you can get in touch with us at the email address on your screen, which is events@think-hq.com.au. Just to run through briefly the programme for the next 45 minutes or so. So as we've said, we're discussing the development of adaptive harvest management for Victoria. We'll kick off with an overview covering what is adaptive management, then focusing on the implementing the adaptive harvest management for Victoria, then spacing out the timeline, and then finishing, as I've already mentioned, with a Q&A session where Graeme and Simon will answer as many of your questions as possible. But without further ado, let me pass over, first of all, to Graeme, who will start the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luke. Adaptive harvest management is not something new. It's being used around the world in many cases, and even in Victoria for duck hunting, it's been 2 decades in development. Adaptive harvest management is a science-based, transparent, adaptive approach, and the key to AHM is that it is a learning and iterative process, not a set methodology. So in those jurisdictions around the world where it's used to manage a range of species in a range of environments, in each case, the inputs and modelling are specific for a particular purpose and the environment in which it operates. Over the past 2 decades of development in Victoria, there's been a number of expert reviews to refine an AHM approach best suited to our conditions and our species. AHM was first proposed in 2002 with a report outlining 2 modelling approaches. In 2009, an expert panel of scientists from Australia, New Zealand and the US recommended monitoring and prototype models. In 2016, a review of the 2010 report was conducted and further recommendations were made for refining AHM inputs and modelling. In 2019, the government convened another expert panel who reviewed the 2016 work and found it was theoretically sound and appropriate. This led in 2010 to the aerial abundance surveys to start data collection on actual game duck abundance in Victoria. And earlier this year, the government committed to implementing AHM to guide the seasonal arrangements for the 2025 season. After more than 2 decades of development, numerous reviews and 5 years of abundance data, we are in a good position for implementation of AHM. And Simon Toop, our Director of Strategy and Research, will now take you through the process that will be applied here. Over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Graeme, and welcome to everybody, and thanks so much for joining us. We really hope that this presentation provides you with some clarity on how the arrangements for duck season will be delivered under an adaptive harvest management system. If we could just move to the next slide. So what is adaptive management? There's been a little confusion around what it actually is. Some people think it's a model, It's actually not. Models are tools that can be used in adaptive management, but adaptive management is actually, it's a process. And in essence, it's about using the best information that you have to select the optimum management response to achieve your management objectives. Results are then monitored, performance of the management approach is evaluated, and adjustments are made. The process is then repeated. So it's often referred to as learning by doing. And in this case, it's continually reviewed, adjusted as we learn more, and particularly how we learn more about how game ducks respond to environmental drivers and harvest regulation. It involves a number of phases. So the first one is the plan phase, and that requires management objectives to be set, management strategies and actions to be identified, and performance indicators to be documented. The do phase requires the implementation of management actions and monitoring programs. And then the evaluate and learn phase requires evaluating the performance of the management actions in achieving the management objective, reporting on the findings, and periodically reviewing the management program itself. The adjust phase is where you revise any of the management actions to improve your effectiveness in achieving your management objective. So then how does that then apply to the Victorian setting? So if we can go to the next slide. So if we look at the plan phase, in 2019-2020, an expert panel recommended that a harvest strategy be developed for Victoria. And in the government's Sustainable Honey Action Plan in 2021 to 2024, it committed to developing that harvest strategy. As I said, the harvest strategy is a key document in that it sets out management objectives and policy parameters. And essentially, it's the rule book that sets up the scene for how you're going to implement your adaptive management process and what the key management objective is that you're trying to achieve. And importantly, the strategy will set out what the proportional harvest level is to set the annual harvest quota. And what that means is what is the percentage of the total population that we can take sustainably each year. And then you consider your management objectives and your management actions to achieve that quota. Now, in that, there's been some previous modelling work done by Dr. Thomas Prowse from University of Adelaide. He's identified that a 10 to 20% harvest would be sustainable. And the development of the harvest strategy will be led by the Department of Jobs, Skills, Industries and Regions. Then we move to the do phase. So this is where we take our actions and we start to apply them and see how they stack up against achieving our harvest objective. So in order for AHM to be applied in Victoria, we need to know critically two things. What's the total game duck abundance in the state and how hunting regulations influence the seasonal harvest levels. So to do that, a population model has been developed. In the 2017 review that was undertaken, it recommended a staged approach to modelling, and the complete model consists of 5 different equations. There's a base model, there's additional models that incorporate movement and demographics, so essentially survival, recruitment, and productivity. The approach that's taken is flexible in that the base model can be used if the only source of data is time series and population counts. That's what we have presently. We have 5 years of abundance data. And then if additional sources of data become available, the modelling approach can be expanded and incorporating these additional structure into the base model. And just on that, we've just entered into an agreement with Deakin University to undertake the largest spatial ecology study, so a satellite tracking project, if you like, to follow the movements of over 400 of our king game duck species to understand what drives their movements and also look at their survivorship. So that will be important input into our population dynamic modelling going forward. So the staged approach that was set out in that early work, which was endorsed by the independent expert panel, allows for AHM to be developed relatively quickly because we can start with that base model. So with the population model in place, we then need to collect input data. So we undertake annually a double observer counts to look at abundance on over 850 randomly selected wetlands and water bodies. And these are stratified into 4 different habitat types. So we have natural wetlands, dams, sewage treatment ponds, streams and rivers, of 3 different size classes, so less than 6 hectares, 6 to 50 hectares, and 50 hectares plus, across 4 bioclimatic zones in Victoria. And once we have those abundance estimates on the randomly selected wetlands that are being surveyed, we then need to extrapolate that out to cover all of the game duck habitat in Victoria. And that's done through the use of the most recent Landsat and Sentinel-2 satellite imagery to derive the number of water bodies of each of those habitat types that contain surface water. And then using sampling methods, we estimate the total game duck abundance for each of those species by extrapolating that out across the entire state. So that's to determine our population abundance. With respect to our harvest models, we need to understand the impact of harvest regulations on the size of the harvest, and a harvest model was developed back in 2020. It is the cornerstone of AHM in that we have the ability then to predict how changing seasonal harvest regulations and controls will change the size of the seasonal harvest. So a statistical relationship between past seasonal arrangements, so bag limits and season length, and also the number of licensed hunters and also the estimated size of the total harvest was modelled. So with the abundance model in place and the harvest model in place, the approach is relatively simple in that we first of all determine the total abundance of game ducks. We apply a proportional harvest percentage to determine the annual seasonal quota, and that also includes wounding and climate change effects. And then through modelling, we calculate the bag limit which would achieve that seasonal quota. So that takes into account steps 2, 3, and 4 in the diagram. The data analysis will be conducted independently by the Arthur Rylah Institute for Environmental Research, and they will prepare a preliminary report which estimates total abundance and also makes a recommendation on the bag limit to achieve the seasonal quota. That's provided to the Game Management Authority Board, who considers that report and then makes a recommendation to government on what the seasonal arrangements might be. Government then considers that. They also consider advice from the policy agencies, so both the Department of Environment and also the Department of Jobs, Skills, Industries and Regions, and then makes a decision on what the seasonal arrangements will be. The hunting season then occurs. And at the same time that the hunting season's underway, we also conduct both bag surveys over the opening week of the season, and also frequent fortnightly phone surveys of hunters to monitor the harvest rates. And that takes into account steps 7 and 8. Then we move into the evaluate, learn and adjust phase. And even though the approach to AHM was developed back in 2017, we haven't stood still. As Graeme pointed out, the approach was independently reviewed by a government expert panel back in 2019-20 and was found to be fit for purpose. The monitoring program to estimate game duck abundance and the relationship between offtake and harvest regulation was designed back in 2020. It was also independently reviewed, and a pilot study or a pilot survey was undertaken in that same year. There were some recommendations that came out of the review that was done by Dr. Prowse and Professor Kingsford, and those recommendations have been implemented, and also each of the annual technical reports that reports back on each of the annual abundance surveys makes a series of recommendations for further improvement as well. So over time, the improvements that we've made to the process have included increasing the number of water bodies that we sample. We're now sampling over 850 annually. We now include waterways such as rivers and streams as additional strata. We've increased the coverage of water bodies by including ground counts where it was not feasible to conduct aerial surveys. So, for example, in some areas there's restricted airspace or it's unsafe to fly. We had some problems with particularly wetlands down in Gippsland and places like sewage treatment plants which have restricted airspace. We now conduct double observer ground counts on those locations so they're not missed. We've also developed a method for obtaining separate abundance estimates for both grey and chestnut teal, because it's impossible to separate female chestnut teal out from grey teal through aerial surveys. We have modified our survey approach to counting or partial counts of large water bodies. Initially, we counted just the edge, and now that's been expanded to include the main water body as well, so there weren't overestimates in the abundance at those locations. And finally, we've investigated alternative models to improve the detection probability of game ducks by observers. So as you can see, even though that process was developed back in 2017, it's undergone constant review and revision. We've also put in place an expert panel to annually review the modelling and monitoring program to make sure that it remains fit for purpose and contemporary. The expert panel will meet at least twice a year and consists of 3 members who have expertise in wildlife ecology, population modelling, quantitative methods and applied statistics. Importantly, the expert panel will meet and review the final technical report that's provided on abundance and the recommended bag limit, and also consider the results of the annual harvest report. And then we can compare the predicted offtake versus the actual offtake. The expert panel will review the program and then provide us with additional advice on whether we need to improve things. Now, they could be that we recalibrate some of the modelling, that we add additional controls, and also that we add additional structure into our modelling program. And the final step there, step number 12, is really important. So that requires periodic review of the harvest strategy, essentially, which again is critical to AHM in setting the management objectives and the actions to achieve those objectives. Department of Jobs, Skills, Industries and Regions will lead that review. That's an independent one and really has a policy focus. And then the process is repeated again. So that gets back to that cycle of iterative learning and review. So when we bring all of that together, AHM in Victoria in its totality looks like the diagram that you have in front of you. It's important to note that all the information about adaptive management, all the technical reports that have been prepared, the reviews that have been undertaken in time, can all be found on the GMA's website on the research page. So I'd encourage anybody, if they want further detail, to have a look at those documents and get familiar with them. So that's AHM for Victoria. In terms of the timelines from here, so how the process will play out, we today completed our aerial surveys and the ground surveys have also been completed. The data will then be presented to the Arthur Rylah Institute. It will then go about modelling the habitat extent, and then once that's done, then they can work out the statewide abundance. Then after that, ARI will also model the bag limits to achieve the seasonal quota, and that preliminary report with his advice will be provided to the GMA in mid-January, and then the GMA board will make its recommendations to the Minister by the end of January. And just a note that the aerial survey was delayed by 3 weeks from when it would normally be held, and that was due to a clash with the supplier's availability. We'll make sure that that doesn't happen again. So from next year, we'll be entering into a 3-year agreement with the supplier and lock in the survey dates so we don't have a clash with any suppliers' other commitments. So that was it. Thank you, Luke.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, both Graeme and Simon. There are lots of questions, which we will do our best to work through in the time that we have left to us. As they've been coming in, we've been trying to sort of group them into groups of 3 or 4, so we'll take them in those baskets, if that's okay. But just to kick off with the first couple. One of the questions that has come through is who defines management objectives? Somebody asking around that. And a sort of broader one that 2 or 3 people have popped in, just thinking a little more about why we're introducing the adaptive harvest method. Now, I know that some of these questions came in at the start and some of them may have been addressed as the presentation went on. But so for the first 2, who defines those management objectives, and a bit more about why we're introducing the AHM?
I'll take the first one, and perhaps Simon's better for the AHM, the technical. So the government, it'll be a policy decision around what the objectives are. So that's the harvest strategy. So that's been prepared by DJ Sir and will be approved or set, put in place by the Minister and regularly reviewed.
And then in terms of, Luke, why we're moving to this approach. So in the past, we've used best available information that we had before us. And they were often multiple lines of evidence. So a whole collection of a series of information. And that information was trying to determine what the status of the duck population was, and therefore whether the duck season need to be varied away from the regulations. So in that, there was a lot of opinion. So people would look at these multiple lines of evidence, draw their own conclusions, and then it was very opinion-based, and that obviously caused conflict and disagreement between people. So AHM is a much more structured approach. It's based on evidence. Once you set the policy objectives that are contained in the harvest strategy, then the monitoring and modelling approach that I outlined will give you answers to how to achieve your policy objectives and your management objective, which are contained in the harvest strategy. So it's a much more structured approach and evidence-based approach to the previous opinion-based approach that was used before.
Great. A question here, take these 2 next. You mentioned about, a few people have asked about the model taking into account wounding losses and climate change. Some questions around how the sort of the approach and the data that led you to be able to do that. And then another question, was it the GMA that developed the AHM? And I think you've touched on that already, Simon. So,
well,
sorry.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. The GMA hasn't developed any of this. Okay. It was the government who committed to implementing AHM back in 2016. And it's been independent experts who have developed the approach, who have scrutinised the approach and deemed it to be appropriate and fit for purpose. So it hasn't been GMA. We've been very careful to make sure that the GMA has not been involved in that. We've given those tasks out to the experts in their field who've developed it. And again, it's been endorsed by independent experts. And what was the second part of that question?
Just asking that you've mentioned that the model takes into account wounding losses and climate change, and a couple of questions around how those 2 issues, both of wounding losses and the broader issue of climate change, how that was taken into account in developing the model.
So the modelling that was done by Dr. Thomas Prowse of the University of Adelaide, he looked at what would be a systemic offtake of game ducks. And In doing that, he included things like wounding, because wounding losses are an important component of the total losses caused by duck hunting. And he used past data to come up with a figure of 23%. There is some research that will be undertaken to determine some contemporary data on wounding losses, and that will commence next year. But for the time being, that 23% level was factored into Dr. Crowther's modelling. He also looked at climate change and also dispersal of birds as well. Now that piece of research is on the Department of Jobs, Skills, Industries and Regions website. It's also linked to on our website. So if people want to look in great detail about how that was done, how those elements were factored in, they can have a look at that report. But they were certainly built into that 10 to 20% recommended proportional offtake.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions, more than a couple, have come in around bag limits. So take two of those if we could. One is, why change the bag limit and not the season length? And another one asking around bag limits, will bag limits change for individual species?
So some previous work done by Professor Marcel Classen, and the historic data that we have on harvesting effort by game licence holders shows us that pretty much on average, irrespective of seasonal conditions and regulatory settings, hunters are pretty much fixed in the amount of effort that they're undertaking in terms of hunting each year. So season length has not been considered, because it seems like, irrespective of the conditions, the same fixed level of effort is input by hunters each year. Now, that's not to say that the season doesn't consider things like animal welfare and avoiding key periods of vulnerability. The season's currently set at the third Saturday in March through to the second Monday in June. And those periods allow for breeding to take place unhindered. So for birds to pair, nest, raise their chicks, and for those chicks to then reach sufficient maturity that they're strong on the wing, and then the season will commence and then closes as we get through to the start of winter, and then again stops. So those factors are considered in setting the season length. And also, as I said, the season length doesn't seem to play a major part presently in regulating the season. So and then another question, Luke, about the bag limits.
Yeah, so will bag limits change for individual species?
So at the moment, the survey can certainly take into account individual species, and we can do estimates of total population on the individual species. The data is stronger, more reliable on the more common species, and those more common species make up 90% of the total seasonal harvest year on year. And those key species are wood duck, grey teal and black duck. So we have very good information on them because they're numerous species, so our data's a lot stronger. That said, as we go through this process and we collect more and more data over time, I think our confidence in the data on those other species gets a lot stronger too. So there's certainly a potential into the future to set individual bag limits for individual species.
Thank you. Just while I'm pulling some others together, one question which has come through, when are we going to get announcements on future duck seasons? Well,
that'll be up to the government. Our plan this year is to provide advice towards the end of January, middle to end of January, depending on everything going as planned. In the future, as Simon mentioned, we're hoping to run we will be running the survey a bit earlier, so that should bring forward our advice to government slightly. But in the end, it's a government's decision or a government announcement. So their timing is out of our hands in that respect. But we would think that it should be a simpler process and an easier decision for government, given the commitment to the science-based approach.
Thank you. That's great. quite a specific one, I'm guessing, which has a number of different elements to it. But what is your confidence in the accuracy of game duck numbers and the population, the population survey? Sorry, game duck abundance and the population survey, and the broader sort of game duck harvest surveys. So I guess the confidence in their accuracy and the numbers therein.
Well, I think the surveys we undertake, the modelling that's applied, is the most comprehensive that's ever been done in this country for waterfowl. So it's a much better process, much more accurate one than previously relying on indices of abundance, and that were collected across Eastern Australia, but it never gave us a complete idea of the total abundance. So our estimates and our confidence levels, our upper and lower confidence levels, are reported completely in the technical reports that are put out, and we have absolute confidence that this process is sound as it is now and will continue to improve in the future. The more and more we run these models, the more and more we understand about how birds respond to the environmental conditions and to harvest regulation, our data will only get better.
Thank you. A few questions on wounding rates. Somebody's asked, how will you measure wounding rates? And somebody's asked sort of at what points and when will those wounding rates be measured?
The proposal is that we start our research in 2026, and that will be based on observation of hunters in the field, and that is the best standard of determining wounding rates that's been practiced worldwide. There's a number of other processes to try and monitor wounding rates, things like hunter-reported wounding rates, which tend to underestimate the level of wounding. We currently undertake an annual X-ray program that looks for embedded shot in birds, but that only provides us with an index of wounding. So the proposed technique that we're going to take forward, starting from 2026 and through to the 2027 year, we'll look at trained observer observations in the field. We're currently working with the world's experts in this and how we structure it, and we'll be training up observers in time. And then a report on that will be due in about 2028, and that will give us the best indication of what actual wounding rates are in the field today, not looking back at it as historic levels.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Sorry, just I wouldn't say struggling to keep up, but they're coming thick and fast. Someone's asked, when will the results of the 2024 game bird harvest be available? And sort of associated with that, how many game ducks were harvested in 2024?
So Arthur Rylah Institute does the data analysis for us. An independent survey company collects the data for us. We survey 1,600 duck hunters throughout the course of the season. That data is then collected, provided to Arthur Rylah Institute. They do the analysis, put together a report, and then that report is released. That report is currently in draft. It's getting towards being approved. So hopefully that harvest report will be released in the coming weeks, if not sooner, with any luck. So I'd rather not say what the estimates are before that process has been both peer-reviewed internally by ARI staff, and then it will be signed off by the director of ARI, and then it will be released by the GMA after that.
Thank you. Somebody has asked that if the survey, if there is a water body on private property, what is the best way, or is there a way for the property owner to get population numbers included in the AHM?
So in the design for the sample sites, they're all randomly selected. So we don't target any particular locations. It's really critical that we do these random selections, because then we can extrapolate the results out to all the different game duck habitat types that are surveyed. So we're not particularly looking for people to say, I've got a bunch of ducks on my wetland, or we know there's a concentration of water birds on a public wetland, for example, because that will just skew and bias the data. They must be randomly selected. That said, we survey hundreds of farm dams, that are on private land. And while they may contain small densities of ducks, when you add up the total number of those wetlands across the state, it does contribute significantly to the overall game duck abundance estimates. So we do survey those wetlands, but it's really critical they are randomly selected and not targeted, if you like, just because they contain birds.
Someone's asked about the what sort of conversations, if any, have gone on with bodies or colleagues in different states in Australia in terms of thinking around the work in this area.
We regularly talk to other states. Other states are watching GMA and this harvest approach, which has been again developed by independent experts. There is a similar program that's done in the Riverina in New South Wales. So the scientists who've developed this program have discussed and been included in designing the program in Australia. Oh, sorry, in Victoria. That said, we have looked elsewhere too. So in that original expert panel review back in 2010, we had experts from New Zealand and also from the US. And then again, in the government expert panel review back in 2019-20, there was a range of experts who work in these fields who considered that 2017 report, which recommended the approach that's currently being taken.
That's great, thank you. So, question here: when will we know the proportional harvest level or the sort of broader harvest objective?
Well, that's in the hands of the department, DJ's Department of Skills, Industry and Region. And we also will need that data, that piece of information, because that'll obviously be the key component to plug into the modelling. It will have to be relatively soon, but we can't give a timeline.
Thank you. Okay. Question here. What is the smallest farm dam size included in the abundance survey?
If it's been randomly selected, we don't have a minimum size.
Okay.
It could be a small quarter-acre dam. As I said, they are all stratified into different size categories, but we don't exclude any farm dams just because it's particularly small. It's got to come up in the database of dams, and that's where it's drawn from and selected as part of the water body assessments. So as long as it's registered, there is a database of dams from across the state, and that's where those farm dams are drawn from for inclusion into the survey.
So just a follow-up question from the random selection, Simon. A couple of people have asked, how does or what is the process for the sort of the random selection of the random selection process? Could you tell us a bit more about how that works?
Look, I'm not full bottle on all the technical details.
Of course.
The technical reports will report on that. I know that they talk about randomly selecting these wetlands, but I couldn't tell you how it actually does that.
That is great. Thank you so much. I'm just having a quick flick through. And so I don't think that I've asked this one, but in terms of when will the game duck harvest strategy be released, and what is the sort of what is the process? What will the consultation process be around that?
Well, I think, as we said, that's something that we're not running. So that'll be a question for the department.
Yeah.
Also than us, but as we said, we expect that the strategy will have to be released relatively soon, because it's an important component of the modelling.
That's great. I think as we're sort of nudging towards the end to wrap up, there are some sort of questions on associated issues and stuff. And as I said at the start, not for sort of discussion of the webinar today, but we will be forwarding those on. I think we've got through as many questions as we can in that time. So all that's left for me to do today is to thank everybody for attending. And thank you so much for your questions. As I've said, the outstanding ones will be sent on. A huge thank you to Graeme and to Simon for their presentation, for their time and expertise answering the questions that came through. And thank you all so much for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.